I've always been fascinated by William Lane Craig. He has the most amazingly articulate and confident way of saying the dumbest things, which gets me wondering, does he do this on purpose? Does he act stupid in a willful attempt to manipulate and fast-talk his audience? Or is there really just a huge gap between his command of the English language and his basic reasoning skills? Join me as I explore these questions, taking a tour of Craig's arguments in a segment I call William Lane Craig, Idiot or Willful Piece of Today we're going to see Craig present his moral argument for God. Before we start, I need to warn you of just a couple things. First, his whole argument is f***ing dumb as shit. Second, we kick off with nearly an uninterrupted minute of him talking about Nazis. But don't worry, it all ties together in time. And who knows, maybe I'll try to find little captions and stuff to add as he talks.
Number 3, objective moral values in the world. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. By objective moral values, I mean moral values which are valid and binding whether anybody believes in them or not. For example, to say that the Holocaust was objectively evil is to say that the Holocaust was wrong even though the Nazis who carried it out believed that it was right. And it would still have been wrong even if the Nazis had won World War II and succeeded in exterminating or brainwashing anybody who disagreed with them. And my argument is that if God does not exist, then moral values are not objective in that sense.
So Craig's point is that the killing of the Jews was objectively wrong, regardless of the culture or whether anybody believes it's wrong. Let's hold that thought in the back of our minds for a while.
Now, many theists and atheists alike concur on this point. For example, Michael Roos, a noted agnostic philosopher of science, explains, the position of the modern evolutionist is that morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. End quote. Friedrich Nietzsche, the great atheist who proclaimed the death of God, understood that the death of God meant the destruction of all meaning and value in life. I think that Friedrich Nietzsche was right.
Craig loves to shroud himself in an air of scholarly respectability by quoting historical figures. The quotes are chosen for an audience that will be impressed by, and grant undue authority to, any lofty-sounding statement from an important-sounding figure. This has the dual effect of making Craig sound well-studied, and, often, elevating Christianity on the backs of respected historical figures who happen to be Christian. Basically, he counts on his audience not to know the difference between a single quote and a sound academic consensus. But here we see him make an even more transparently sleazy move. Here he takes carefully selected quotes from people he represents as authorities on atheism and uses them to put forth an atheistic view that there's no morality or meaning without God. But atheist views are far more varied and nuanced than Craig is trying to imply here, and disingenuously selected quotes from Roos or Nietzsche do not define the atheist perspective on morality any more than disingenuously selected quotes from Fred Phelps or Joel Osteen define the Christian perspective on anything. And that's all I'm going to say on this. Craig is being such an obviously cynical bullshitter here that I refuse to honor this move by discussing it any further.
But we've got to be very careful here. The question here is not, must we believe in God in order to live moral lives? I'm not claiming that we must. Nor is the question, Can we recognize objective moral values without believing in God? I certainly think that we can. Rather, the question is, if God does not exist, do objective moral values exist?
In other words, Craig isn't making any demonstrable claim about morality. If he talked about the behavior of atheists versus the behavior of Christians, I doubt his arguments would be compelling, but at least they'd be testable. But instead of giving us even that much, he concedes that atheists and Christians can both be good, then retreats into obscure philosophical territory where he can find grammatically complex ways to BS about pure abstractions. Also, his starry-eyed followers can jizz their pants in admiration, then walk away feeling vaguely smart about their faith.
Like Professor Roos, I honestly don't see any reason to think that in the absence of God, the morality evolved by Homo sapiens is objective. In the absence of God, we are just accidental byproducts of nature which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe and which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. On the atheistic view, some action, say rape, may not be socially advantageous, and so in the course of human development has become taboo. But that does absolutely nothing to prove that rape is really wrong. On the atheistic view, there's nothing really wrong with your raping someone. Thus, without God, there is no absolute right and wrong which imposes itself on our conscience.
I'm curious who put Craig in charge of defining the atheistic view. Even in the absence of God, I would avoid raping someone because of the fear, pain, and long-term trauma I would be causing my victim. That's reason enough for me, and I find it shocking that it might not be reason enough for Craig. It doesn't matter that she's a short-lived creature who happened to evolve on a speck of dust in a hostile universe and that we'll all eventually be gone. She's still a conscious being, and the mechanics of how her consciousness arose are simply inconsequential. She still has a mind. She still feels. Thus I feel just as responsible to her, and my other fellow human beings, as Craig feels to his imaginary God. Of course, he might retort that this still doesn't bring me to an objective standard of morality. But I contend that a person's obligation not to harm a human being is no less real and objective than a person's obligation not to offend a bigger, more invisible creature. If you find that you live in a universe with God, then fine. Figure out how you're obligated to that God and live accordingly. But then if you find that you live in a universe without a God, do you just throw up your hands and say, "F it, I'll just act however I want toward the beings who do exist"? Of course not. You figure out how you're obligated toward humans and live accordingly. This isn't complicated. But that said, I still understand the fear that Craig is tapping into here. The fear that since we're morally unreliable creatures, we as a species can't produce any kind of objective standard of behavior. After all, what if some people in some cultures think that in some situations it's okay to commit genocide, or molest children, or euthanize the elderly? These possibilities are all problematic because we recognize that needless or excessive harm to an innocent person is flatly immoral, regardless of the time, culture, or context per Craig's argument about the Nazis, and that it's morally destabilizing whenever somebody might 1. Cause this kind of harm, 2. Demonstrate no remorse for doing so, and most of all, 3. Find such an action to be morally acceptable or even desirable. This is Craig's problem with the Nazis, or with any of the theoretical people he proposes who think rape and murder are okay. Since humans can get things so backward, there must be some external lawgiver from whom our morals come. Right? Okay, fine. Let's be generous enough to grant Craig that much. The big question then becomes, how did he decide that God is suited to fit this role? Having noticed our human shortcomings, did Craig open-mindedly approach God, objectively trying to see if he is perfect where humans are not? Did he, before ever deciding that God is good, run him through these 3 criteria to see whether God was capable of causing needless or excessive harm without apology while thinking he was doing the right thing? And if Craig could come up with even one such example, would he disqualify God as moral lawgiver and move on? After all, Craig's a serious philosopher, right? And having seen any pattern whereby humans fail as objective moral lawgivers, he would want to be equally rigorous in determining whether any theoretical deity better fits this role, right? Of course not. Craig has no interest whatsoever in doing such a thing. If we were to start from square one, using Craig's common examples of genocide, rape, cruelty, and child abuse, and objectively evaluate God based on what we see in the Bible, we would find that he immediately fails as Craig's theoretical moral lawgiver. He commands genocide. He's at best indifferent about rape, at least in terms of the effect it has on the victim, and at times tells his people to rape girls from rival tribes. He arguably commands child abuse and does little if anything to explicitly address it. And on top of it all, he subjects everybody who doesn't believe in him to hell, which is possibly the worst conceivable form of cruelty imaginable. In all these things, and more, God visits needless or excessive suffering upon the innocent without remorse, all the while seeing his own actions as right. In other words, he in every way fits Craig's profile of a morally backward human. But of course, this is where Craig and other Christians start to make all the typical excuses for God. But again, we all recognize that needless or excessive harm is wrong, in spite of culture or circumstances. So to construct these excuses, and to maintain that God is still morally perfect, Christians must either 1. Assume that God had a broader and totally incomprehensible reason for what he did, or 2. Just decide that morality is defined by God's personal standard of holiness. But these options are useless for sincerely trying to determine whether someone is good. One involves a purely speculative guess, the other is just flatly arbitrary, and neither logically demonstrates that God succeeds morally where humans have failed. Rather than concluding that God is good because of his actions, they decide he's good in spite of his actions, and it's hard to see where Christians think this gets them in any conversation with an unbeliever. In short, Craig puts humans through a test designed to show whether they're morally infallible, and when they fail, he proposes God. But instead of putting God through that same test, he just does an end run around the very criteria he used to disqualify humans and declares God as perfectly moral for no logical reason whatsoever. This isn't even a bad argument for God as objective moral lawgiver. It's no argument at all. Craig just slips in the assumption that God's good, counting on the fact that his audience had already decided he was good before ever thinking about it. This cuts to the core of how Craig, and most other apologists, operate. Behind all the hand-waving and elaborate phrasing, Craig does not argue from evident premises to an inescapable conclusion. Unless he's an idiot, he does not truly and sincerely offer arguments like these to his opponent in a debate. He speaks past his opponent and directly to his sympathetic audience of predisposed believers, leaning all his arguments on a few core assumptions he knows they'll make along with him. But this rant has gone on long enough, so let's watch as Craig tries to distill all this fear-mongering into a formal logical argument.
But the problem is that objective values do exist, and deep down I think we all know it. There's no more reason to deny the objective reality of moral values than the objective reality of the physical world. Actions like rape, cruelty, and child abuse aren't just socially unacceptable behavior. They're moral abominations.
If you listen closely, you'll notice that Craig never lists actions that offend God based on some esoteric standard of holiness. He always brings up things like genocide, rape, cruelty, or child abuse, all focused on how humans treat humans, and all designed to evoke our visceral disgust for the perpetrator and our deepest empathy for the victim. We hate seeing wanton harm visited upon the vulnerable, and we recognize that if such behavior is allowed to continue, it will destabilize society and may eventually threaten our safety, just as it violated the safety of others. Thus, we have every secular reason to be revolted by and curtail these behaviors. Whether you want to say this technically counts as a philosophically objective standard of morality is of no consequence. We agree upon it, and we very successfully create a better society through our agreement. And throwing a cruel, genocidal, rape-apologizing, child-murdering God into the mix does nothing to help us through this process.
As Michael Ruth himself admits, the man who says raping little children is morally acceptable is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. Some things, at least, are really wrong. Similarly, love, equality, generosity, and self-sacrifice are really good. Thus, we can summarize this third consideration as follows. Premise 1. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. 2. Objective values do exist, from which it follows logically and inescapably. 3. Therefore, God exists.
In arguing that the mere existence of morality proves a God, Craig creates an illusion for us. He appeals to the fact that most of us as humans are offended by many of the same things, then takes a huge logical leap by saying that our shared revulsion over some human actions represents an objective moral standard that not only has to be outside ourselves, but must reside within the mind of a God. Literally, that's all he does. Cutting through all the fluff that came before and after, his entire argument for the existence of objective morality is,
objective values do exist, and deep down I think we all know it.
In fact, let's listen to this again, because once you think about it, it's just so f***ing funny.
Objective values do exist, and deep down I think we all know it.
That's seriously his whole basis for premise 2 of his argument, pointing out a strong feeling we have inside ourselves and giving us an intuitive-sounding explanation for what that feeling is. Of course, he built up to it some by talking about the Nazis and implying that rape would be okay if we did not believe in God. But all this does is stoke our revulsion, prepping us emotionally so that we'll want to see this feeling as something objective. Then he asserts it one more time before listing off things he knows will get a positive or negative reaction out of his audience, counting on your desire for all those things to be objective. Classy, huh? So let's bring this back to our central question in light of what we just saw. When William Lane Craig selected 2 quotes to hint that atheists don't think we have any source of meaning or morality without God, was he being an idiot, or was he willfully being a piece of shit? When William Lane Craig said that the pain and suffering experienced by a rape victim should not be enough to stop us from raping people, was he being an idiot, or was he willfully being a piece of shit? When William Lane Craig determined that humans are morally unreliable, but then just counted on us to assume God was perfect for no demonstrated reason whatsoever, was he being an idiot, or was he willfully being a piece of shit? And finally, when William Lane Craig expected us to assume that objective morality exists by literally saying deep down you know it, was he being an idiot, or was he willfully being a piece of shit? I look forward to your feedback. Note, the title of this video does not imply that Craig as a person is either an idiot or a willful piece of shit. Rather, it's asking whether he's momentarily being an idiot or a willful piece of shit when he says certain things. Legally, the phrase willful piece of shit does not accuse Craig of any specific action and is thus not slanderous.